Hello everybody, it's Ernie again, and today we're talking all about co-signers on a lease. Let's get started. Like always, we welcome back those of you who watch and rewatch our content. We welcome comments down below, and if you like our content, give us a like. Haven't subscribed yet? Consider subscribing. So there are certain occasions where a co-signer is a perfectly good idea. One of those happens to be when you're signing a commercial lease. This comes up in commercial property because sometimes the tenant is actually a company, an entity. 123 Produce Company, LLC, who knows? Now, while this is a person in the eyes of the law, it's not an actual person. And so generally speaking, if you are a commercial landlord, it's a great idea for you to have a personal guarantor. Sometimes it's one of the members of the company. Sometimes it's one of the officers. It's sometimes an owner. Sometimes it's a silent partner. Who knows? But your application and your background check should be for the person who is actually on the hook. The company is great, but the company may not have assets that you can go after in the event of a default. So a personal guarantor is super and necessary in these situations. But when you're talking about a residential lease, it's a little bit different. Sometimes you have the college student. And if you're in a college town, you probably get this a lot, where the college kid doesn't have anything but their student loans or maybe a grant or two, a scholarship that might provide some housing. But as far as employment, many of them just don't have it, or they don't have sufficient employment to justify you approving them over a more qualified applicant. But what they do have sometimes is mom and dad. And sometimes mom and dad will sign a personal guarantee for the college student. And for those of you who routinely lease to college students, this is probably something that you're perfectly comfortable with. And you probably already have enough experience with it that you can run this seamlessly. So where could some problems come even in this situation? Well, naturally, a tenant should be the person who is the most financially invested in the property being well maintained and the rent being paid on time. When a college student is the only listed tenant, there may be a problem if the only thing you can go after mom and dad for are potential damages in a separate lawsuit down the way. By including a guarantor, you have someone else who you could potentially sue in a subsequent lawsuit if a tenant damages property or fails to pay rent or harms you in some other way. It's always good to have somebody else to go after, particularly when the primary tenant just doesn't have the assets to cover the debt. However, there are some other pitfalls to consider other than the possibility of default. Sometimes a co-signer will actually be someone who is a shield of people who are otherwise terrible tenants. If the primary person, it has some kind of justifiable basis for not being employed or not having a rental history, okay, there are some situations where that's true. The student, for example, that we mentioned before. But if this is someone who isn't a college student and should otherwise have access to credit history and employment history, that should already be an alarm bell going off for you. Just because you know that the primary tenant isn't paying the rent, the fact that a third party is paying the rent doesn't mean that the primary tenant should not also be investigated in your application process. Make sure that if there is a case where someone else will be paying rent, that the primary tenant who is residing on the property is also checked out. You'll want to know a criminal background check. You'll want to know whether or not this person has ever been evicted. You'll also want to know any employment. You'll even want to research their credit history. Sometimes people will have grandma sign the lease as the primary tenant and then move in later, never allowing you to know that grandma never intended to move in. Now, this is a different situation. So in this case, the primary tenant disclosed in the lease is someone who is never going to occupy the premises. You have a situation where an unauthorized occupant has taken residency. This should be a clear default in your lease. If it's not, you really should modify your lease to prevent this kind of thing. It happens when you have people who otherwise would not pass the application process. You'll also want your application process to include a provision or a statement that limits the people who can reside on the property to the people who were actually subject to the application process. Your lease should also clearly identify who the occupants of the premises will be. If the tenant who signed isn't even residing on the premises, you'll probably want a provision that declares that the premises has been abandoned by the only leaseholder entitled to possession. By knowing what to expect in these situations, you can avoid problems with tenants down the way. Remember, just because someone is showing up with a cosigner or someone who is willing to be a personal guarantor doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but you should approach each situation with a certain degree of scrutiny. Remember, the primary tenant, even if they will not be the ones paying the rent, should be investigated. Also, make sure that there's some justification for the need for assistance. Again, sometimes a person in college or a young couple is, receiving assistance from mom and dad, and you may determine that this situation works for you. But again, you'll want to investigate even these individuals to make sure that you're not having the wool pulled over your eyes, and that mom and dad are not just some smokescreen to prevent you from rejecting potential tenants who have a bad record. Finally, if you're not checking the credit history of the personal guarantor, you don't really have a personal guarantor you can rely on. Make sure that even they go through the same scrutiny that you give tenants, because it doesn't make sense to have someone who's going to be a backup if they themselves have terrible credit or no employment or a criminal history of fraud. All these things do not make for a good guarantor. If you are going to go through the step of allowing someone to guarantee the rent payments for a third party, make sure you do your diligence and have them checked out as well. Generally speaking, it's a good idea that the tenant who signs the lease is the person who's living on the premises. That the person who's living on the premises is the person who's paying the rent. Because the person who's paying the rent is generally going to be the most interested in preserving and maintaining the integrity of the property and preserving and maintaining their own creditworthiness for future endeavors. If you're approached by a tenant who wants to sign an uncommon lease with you, ask questions. As always, my contact information is here on the bottom of the screen. You can seek out the assistance of other landlords in our Facebook group, Texas Landlords, where we have well over 1,000 landlords who are interested in the things you're interested in and have seen the kinds of things that you may be seeing now. Experience matters in this field, so get in a group, ask questions, find a mentor, be able to prevent problems before they ever happen, and you'll be much better off. Landlords, as always, thanks so much for joining us, and until next time, happy leasing. If you enjoyed this video, we invite you to like and subscribe. Follow our links to even more great content. We're always adding to this collection. If you have a video topic you'd like to see, comment below.